Okay, all right. So yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so for the first question, it's the Shakers earn a 5 on the socioeconomic spectrum compared with later experiments in economic equality. They did well economically. Their communities also survived for a long time, well over a century. All this despite their refusal to procreate. So how did they make it work economically? So I can start with this one. I thought it was interesting how on page 50 they explained that whatever was owned by one shaker was owned by all of the shakers. And I thought that this would kind of cut cost a lot because I think essentially it made all of the shakers equal. Like there was no higher class, middle class, lower class. If someone had access to one thing, everyone did. So I feel like that really boosted their community, but also economically, they wouldn't have to waste extra profits on buying new things or having a surplus of other things. They could all just kind of share and keep economically cost low that way.
Yeah,
Yeah,
essentially like a collectivism. Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, sorry, my bad. I mean, I think I cut you off.
I agree with what you said, and also on page 54 and page 55, it talked about how they bought like materials in bulk, so like it was much cheaper for them. And on page 55, it talked about like how they established business, such as including furniture making and seed production, which provided them steady income for their communities.
Yeah, I think with the seed production, I thought it was kind of interesting how you couldn't discern if it was good seed or bad seed. So one, that's profitable because whatever they do generate, they'll be able to sell. But also it kind of talked about their reputation, how people knew if they were buying from them that they would be getting good products. I thought that was interesting because there's no way for them to prove if it's good or bad. It's more just that the Shakers kind of kept to themselves and had a good reputation and like a good moral standing that people were still buying from them.
Yeah, we
Yeah. Yeah, I guess like the reputation was like essential because throughout like the text, it mentioned that like they're pretty much like ostracized by the mainstream society and like so much conflict that they experienced. I think like one of the passages that stood out was like um the leader, Mother Ann, it was like she was like taken and beaten by like a mob. Like that was just kind of scary, I suppose, during that time. So yeah, I mean, for them to like still be able to establish a connection with like the outside world, I would say that's pretty admirable.
Yeah, they also like practice strictly like simplicity, meaning like, they avoided waste, which like really helped them maintain, economically stable. Yeah, they were very simple and keeping things, using whatever they needed and not, having waste.
Should we move on to the second question?
Yeah, do you guys
Um,
have anything else to add? I think we
no.
pretty much talked about everything that talked about like,
Mhm.
their economic stability.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so the second one refers to the governance spectrum. Here, the Shakers face the dilemma that all profit led movements have to face eventually once the leader dies. How did Shaker governance evolve over time?
Um, so on page 45, right, it talked about, I quote, it says, while Lee's death caused some converts to leave faith, but it did, slow the spread of her gospel. And also it talked about like after death of her founder Anne Lee, the Shakers faced a lot of challenges, maintaining their governance structure without having their leader present. But like over the time, like they developed a hierarchy system of government with elderly leaders managing day-to-day affairs for their communities. So over the time they did evolve, but they did face struggle after the death of their leader.
Were like the positions of leaders chosen? Was that ever clarified in the text?
I think my understanding of it is like Mother Ann and then Joseph and then right. I think they were kind of thought of as like kind of like prophetic figures. So like
Mhm.
they represented I had written this a little bit in the discussion, like they represented, like I think it's like the Holy Mother. I think Joseph was compared to like the Apostle Paul. Because I know after Wright died, I think it's on page 73, there was no other mother or father. Then they went into more like centralized government. I think they just kind of held that religious authority. And then once the three of them had died, then it was just more elders. So I don't think they were like chosen specifically by like any type of voting. It was more that they were spiritually recognized. At least that's my understanding of it.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like they had like the most like spiritual charisma out of the entire group. Like so like kind of similar to a pope then, if you think about it. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, like that's how I felt about it. Like another thing that stood out to me is that like they were like pretty progressive for their time, because I mentioned that like I think Joseph Meacham he elected. I have it here in my notes. He elected Lucy Wright as the first like woman minister, and that was like pretty unprecedented for the time because back then, you know, in like the mainstream Christianity, women didn't really have like a voice, and like they weren't really able to like you know be like religious leaders within the community. So I thought it was pretty interesting. It was like I suppose one of like the first roots of feminism, you know, in like the Shaker community.
Yeah, I definitely noticed that. And I think it even said it a few times through the reading that they were like kind of past their time. Like, and I think it's interesting because even when Wright had died, they still had two men and two women governing them. So I thought it was kind of nice to see how after that last like maternal figure had died that they still continued that tradition while also they also had a lot of emphasis on like order and equality. So I think that does make sense why it was balanced like that, but I do agree that they were progressive for their time. Okay, does anyone have anything else to add? Okay. So for the third one, drawing on Professor Sam Weinberg's comments in text one, should we resist doing when reading about the Shakers or any other past group? Generally, how hard was it for you to empathize with these folks?
Um, I can start it off. I can start off with that. Yeah. Yeah. So essentially what I got from Professor Weinberg's comments is that you shouldn't really judge past societies by today's standards. Like obviously like you know, I think back to saying I think what was it, the Utopians in their Utopia society. And essentially, you know, I think that was written in like the 16th century when slavery was still pretty mainstream. And I think like one of the passages mentioned like utopian like slaves had like better standards of living compared to other nations, but it was still slavery. And that was pretty commonplace for the time. So I think like applying that to this, it's I think like the message should be that like, you know, we might like consider like the Shaker groups fanatics today, but I think like back then they were pretty much just like, you know, one community just trying to practice religion in their own way. That's pretty much what I got from that.
Yeah. Yeah, same. Yeah, I was kind of confusing at first, like what he was trying to say and like making a connection from his video to the reading. But based on what I understood, that like we shouldn't judge them based on like our reality. We should look at this type of readings through like historic context because it was written like long time ago. So, instead of putting our beliefs, put ourselves in their shoes and how they felt and writing that so it can help us a deep understanding of the motivations and experience through their writing and readings.
Yeah, I definitely think with reading text like this, sometimes it's almost easier to like realize what's foreign to me or what seems like crazy to me. And then that kind of makes me think about, well, it was probably normal in the time period that we're reading it. Cause I know, like he said, like time and place was important and that we kind of have to put ourselves in their shoes. And so I think it's just important to like realize that what they were doing at their time was not normal because they were a little bit different than other religious groups, but in their time period, they did things that were ahead of their time and also just what was normal for their time.
Yeah, yeah, especially like pros and cons. Like of course, like I think we touched upon like just now is like, you know, with the equality between like the two sexes, there wasn't really like just well, I don't want to say that was discrimination because there were like some people who were kind of opposed to having women in power within the group, but like it was like a little bit more accepted than like uh, regular society. And I think like it was like mentioned within like the passages is like they would have like these celebrations where they would do dances as if they were possessed by spirits. um I think like I don't know. Well, let's see, if I were to be in that time, like, and if I was part of like, not the non-shaker group, I would definitely think like there was like some sort of like witchcraft, so to say, going on
Yeah.
within that group. So yeah, I would definitely, I don't know, if I were living during that time, I'd probably be disposed to like thinking of like, oh, that group is kind of weird. We should probably, disassociate ourselves from them, something along those lines.
And I think someone was like writing an article about, against their like religious beliefs because of the dancing and all that. Yeah, it's really scary.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
thought the whole like them not procreating thing was a little bit for that time too, a little bit very unstandardized because they really had to rely on just converts and they also took in a lot of orphans, but like for them not to procreate, it's kind of crazy because like how would they grow their religion and their community? And I feel like even back then that was definitely something that wasn't like normal. And I feel like today that's not really normal either. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I know, that's crazy. I remember, yeah, reading about it. It was like everyone was abstaining, from sex. So I was wondering, like, how exactly are they getting that many converts that their numbers just kept on growing?
I don't, they must have just like been very persuasive to an extent, or like just really got people to like understand how they viewed things. But I guess also
Mhm.
taking in a lot of orphans, like they were able to grow up and then teach them those learnings without them knowing anything else. So I would wonder, like, of like if there was a ratio, like would most of their like population be from the like children that they took in when they were younger or from other converts? Because I remember towards the beginning of it, it would say like they would only get like a handful of converts when they kept moving around different places. And then, but as like time went on, I think they got to like 6,000 followers by the time like everything was done in like the 1800s, I think. So it's kind of crazy to see how they got that far without procreating.
Yeah.
Okay, do we want to do the fourth one?
Um, sure. I don't know, unless anyone else has anything to add.
Well, I think we covered the most of it, like all the time.
Okay. To close, have someone read aloud the final two paragraphs of the chapter slowly. First, let's clarify key terms. What do the Shakers mean by living simply? What is the paradox in the song lyric? Finally, how much do you empathize with the Shaker philosophy as expressed in the song lyric? I can read it. The Shakers' aversion to the world as they found it and their exuberant millenarian hopes combined to liberate them from any regard for the established forms of human association. Within their villages, they built an entirely new kind of society, one founded upon total equality, spiritual transcendence, and a utopian faith in the perfectibility of life on earth. We are the people who turn the world upside down, Anne liked to say. Ultimately, life within Zion was less about what the Shakers did than about what they didn't do, namely, just about everything that might be called worldly. To them, this state of total abstention, what they called being simple, added up to a doctrine of radical freedom freedom from appetite, from nature, from impulse, and perhaps most important, from the conventions of the world. By scorching out the lusty, scuffling habits of Babylon, the Shakers hope to perfect and liberate their souls and their community. Their best known song celebrates this remarkable paradox. I will bow and be simple. I will bow and be free.
It's asking like, what did the Shakers mean by living simply?
I think we
Could it be
kind
a
of,
reference to like God is like, not wanting like material wealth or things of that nature? It's just really like the religious stuff you should focus on.
yeah, I definitely agree. I think a lot of the actions they took was based on like religious things and like prophetic things. And I think also the way that they shared everything kind of like links to living simply because they like wouldn't be buying extravagant things. Like they would only have what they needed and then pass that around.
Exactly, I agree with what you both said. Like they didn't believe in like living a luxury life instead of like collectivism, having everything together, sharing with others and just living a simple life devotion to God and rejecting the materialistic world.
Yeah, like I know there was one passage where they talked about like they would buy expensive paints for some of their buildings, but they would only do that because they were trying to like fulfill a vision of like what heaven looked like. So they weren't doing that to like make it look pretty. They were doing it for a religious reason, which is why like they like don't really believe in material things.
Yeah. Yeah, and to add on to that, I think I remember reading this part. It was like they would make these chairs for angels to sit in, and like they would like essentially like make each one of them unique to like specific angels. And I thought like that was like extreme like devotion to their religion and way of life.
Okay, so the next part is what is the paradox in the song lyric? I took that as it being I will bow and be free. Because to me, I was like, well, if you're bowing to someone or something, like normally that means that person has control or some type of control over you. So how could you bow but also be free at the same time? That was kind of my understanding of the last sentence.
Yeah, I thought of like, refer to like how after, living like a simple life, they still found like happiness and contentment, through the simplicity of their life. Like how, we believe like having a material things makes us happy, but for them, it wasn't that. It was just, their simple life and their devotion to the God.
Yeah. I'm actually a little confused on that part because it's like you're submitting to God. So does that really make you free? Like, are you like really free to like live your life the way you want to? Because you have to like prioritize your religious beliefs over really like anything else in life. You can't have like you can't like procreate or anything. You can't have material wealth, things of that nature. So I don't know. I feel like it kind of goes against like the idea that like you're free, but at what cost? It's like, yeah, you do have like, your needs met, but you're not really like free, like, to like stray from like the path of the community.
I think that from like everything that we've read in it, like obviously now when we read this, we're kind of like, well, it doesn't make sense that they say they're free, but I think that they kind of had the mentality that their submission to God is what set them free because they were like very religious people, and I think that showed through a lot of their workings of their community. And I think like us living in the time period we do now, that's why we have questions about it. But back then, if we were in their shoes, I think that they would be so devoted to it that they would feel free, that that's what let them like live their life, that drove their everyday life.
Yeah, for them, I think it wasn't just like, like devoting to a God, praying. For them, I think it was like a lifestyle, like just the way living the life.
Oh yeah, my bad, but I just like kind of like, I guess like it glitched a little bit. I was a little cut off, but like, are you guys still on part two?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Well, I guess that was kind of like a little bit of part three, because part three is like, how do you empathize with the Shaker philosophy? So I feel like that's kind of how I, like what I said, like that's what set them free. I feel like that's kind of how I empathize with them. And I think with that kind of thinking, it's not hard to empathize with them because it was a different time and place. But other than that, I don't really see how you could, like I said, be under someone's control and be free. Like that's the kind of the only way I see it making sense with like what we read.
Yeah, I mean, like in terms of like empathizing, I don't know. I feel like like nowadays with like today what we like in like the world we're living in, it's a little hard because it seems like this was an extreme sect of the religion. But I mean, like I guess like I suppose you could still like consider like some of the more major religions today as like having a little bit of like I don't know compare a little comparison between them. So like for example, in like the Jewish like religion, you're not really allowed to like eat like specific you're not allowed to eat specific foods like they have to be kosher for example. So I think like I don't know in like that sense you're not really like free from like your religion in terms of like how in terms of like eating whatever you want. You have to like keep in mind like if it goes against your religion or not.
Yeah, I like how we all are talking about like if they felt free, like like how we were talking about like if they, for them if it was free or not, if they felt free or not. But I wonder like if they even ever thought of that type of question, like if they ever felt like I'm not free because of my religion is preventing me from doing this or that. So yeah.
I'm sure maybe the people who left the religion, maybe if it wasn't for the reasons of like the females in power, I'm sure maybe there was some people that did have that thought process and left. I mean, we don't really get any type of information from that from the text, but I feel like in any regard, in any religion, there's always extremists that follow it to the T, which I feel like is kind of what the Shakers' philosophy was. Whereas nowadays, there's people who really just practice what they want of each religion. So I think we've become a little bit more lax. Whereas like back then, religion was a lot more eminent.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, people were definitely more religious back then. Yeah. Yeah, and like
I
I don't know, even still like these guys would be considered like extreme like fanatics of the religion. So it's a little it's a I don't know. It's like a debate, I suppose, of like, how deeply should you follow your religion? Should you like follow it to the letter, like, or should you follow like the spirit of like, what it says?
Yeah, well, I feel like in their time, I think that they had to be thought of as fanatics too. Like, especially now, like as we're reading about them, we see them as fanatics. But I feel like for their time period, they were like very strict with all of their beliefs that they uphold. So I think it's kind of just how you view religion and how you choose to participate in it. And I think we can all agree that in any like type of sense that they were fanatics in their own way.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I mean, they were like they weren't violent or anything. They were pacifists, so they weren't really like a threat to anyone.
I
And
think
they weren't forcing anyone though, they were just spreading their like religion, just telling people this is what we follow, and if you want to follow this, you can join. So
I think maybe that's what also let them stay around for so long. They were no threat to anybody because they were pacifists. So I think realistically, people just kind of let them be. And like that was that. So they were able just to slowly grow their numbers.